Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. If it's okay, we will get started with the committee, Policy and Governance Committee. I'd like to call the meeting of the Policy and Governance Committee to order for August 1st, 2023. We will begin with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to recognize that Ottawa is located on unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Host Nation. The peoples of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. The Ottawa Police Services Board honors the peoples of and land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Today, Ottawa is home to approximately 40,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Ottawa's Indigenous community is diverse, representing many nations, languages, and customs. The Ottawa Police Services Board honors all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people and their valuable past and present contributions to this land. We are currently broadcasting on Zoom and live streaming on YouTube. Given this meeting is being held electronically, I want to caution that there's a possibility of technical difficulties. Should we receive any disruptions, I would ask that everyone remain patient as we work to fix the issue and resume the meeting as soon as possible. I will now proceed with the confirmation of the agenda. Confirmation of agenda, that the Policy and Governance Committee confirm the agenda of 1st of August 2023 meeting. Is the agenda confirmed?
Confirmed.
Great, thank you. Confirmation of minutes. Minutes number 12 of 1st May 2023, that the Policy and Governance Committee confirm minutes number 12 of the 12th May 2023 meeting. Are the minutes confirmed?
Confirmed.
Confirmed, thank you. Declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none, I will proceed. First item of business, 4.1, OPS briefing on the use of force. This item is arising from a motion raised by Vice Chair Fakarani and passed by the board in May of this year, asking for this briefing. Use of force by police, while necessary at times, continues to be a contentious issue facing police services. We also know from data that we collect that use of force is disproportionately applied to racialized members of our community. It is important that we stay on top of this issue and the steps we are taking to address this disparity. And with that, I will turn things over to you, Chief, for the services presentation.
Thank you, Chair Doucette. I appreciate that, and welcome to the members of the P&G committee. I'm pleased to join our team today as we discuss use of force and policing, on a really broad scale, and really some issues we're going to go into quite a bit of detail. Application of use of force is an area that has evolved and continues to evolve. And so while this is an information session for the committee, it is also an opportunity for our team to look at our use of force program holistically and confirm that we are leading the way in how we train on use of force, how we employ the use of force model and de-escalating techniques during our daily operations. And also, as important, we can evaluate ourselves and enhance our use of force and de-escalation techniques moving forward. We have a number of our internal experts here today to present quite a bit of content to you. This is a pretty big presentation. I'm confident that they'll be able to provide you with the information that you need as board members, and I know there will be a time for questions, and there will be questions for sure. So once again, thank you for being here today, and I will turn things over to Deputy Chief Bell to lead off his team's presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Chief. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. Happy that you had myself and our team here today. As the Chief mentioned, today's presentation will be extensive and we'll go into depth in a lot of different areas. And it'll be a team effort from a bunch of our experts. So with me today is our Chief Human Resources Officer, Lisa Bianco, Inspector John Mbakulu, who's in charge of our training and recruiting, Staff Sergeant Jeff LeBlanc, who is responsible now for recruiting, but has extensive experience with our Professional Development Center, and Acting Superintendent Frank Daou. This is a wide topic for us to discuss, and we have many things to review with you today. Today's session will provide a broad overview, but we're always happy to share additional information on any of the areas now or in the future as the need arises. Lots of information to go through. So if it's good with committee members, we'll hold questions to the end because we touch on a lot of different areas. So Heather, you can go to the next slide, please. So we appreciate the board's interest in ensuring oversight in our use of force. You play a very important role in all of this. Use of force is a unique power granted to police officers legislatively, and it is a power that is not granted to any other member of society. I think it's important to note off the start that in the vast majority of interactions between the police and the public, use of force is not needed, and officers successfully use de-escalation techniques. In fact, in 2022, OPS officers were dispatched to almost 215,000 calls. Officers used force in a total of 247 incidents. Of these, 24 were incidents in which police used their weapons on an animal, primarily to end the suffering of the animal involved in a motor vehicle accident. One incident was an unintentional discharge, which resulted in no injuries. Thus, there were 222 incidents in which OPS officers used force on one or more individuals. Of these incidences, 52 were for mental health apprehensions, 20 for weapons or firearms related calls, 17 for assault police officer, and 16 for assault with a weapon. As the numbers indicate, officers use de-escalation techniques in the vast majority of circumstances, but are required to use force occasionally to ensure the safety of the public, the subject, and themselves. Because of this, we take use of force extremely seriously and know that appropriate checks and balances in how we ensure that there's appropriate checks and balances in how we use force, and limiting use of force is critical to maintaining and building public trust. We have a multitude of training, policies, and oversight mechanisms, as well as experts in place, and we continuously look at how we can adapt and improve our use of force training and deployment. It's important that the board have a strong understanding of use of force. Today, we'll provide a very much in-depth look at this typically provided on use of force and de-escalation techniques in policing, the rationale for such, controls and oversight practices in place, and plans for enhancing use of force and de-escalation techniques moving forward. Before you is your motion. The motion extends from the previous PSB's motion dating back to 2020. I'm confident that today's session will address the board's motion, and happy to now introduce Inspector John Mbakulu, who will walk us through the legislative and regulatory framework that governs use of force and de-escalation in policing within Ontario.
Thank you, Deputy. Good afternoon, everyone. In the next 2 slides, I'll be presenting the legislative framework that allow for police to lawfully use force. Police use of force, including information on member training, de-escalation, and non-force options, are set and governed by established policies at the federal, provincial, and municipal level. My next 2 slides deal with that legislative oversight. Federally, to begin at the macro level, federally, Section 25 of the Criminal Code of Canada sets the boundaries for persons authorized by law, such as police officers and peace officers, in the course of their duties to use as much force as necessary in order that they're able to carry out their duties. And those powers are limited by Section 26 of the Criminal Code that states that anyone that's authorized by law in the course of their duties to use force are criminally responsible for any excessive use of such authority based on the nature and the quality of the act that constitutes that excess. The sections allow police to use the force that is reasonable, necessary, and proportionate while outlining the consequences for abusing that authority. Provincially, the ministry responsible for policing is the Ministry of the Solicitor General, and the governing statute for police services is the Police Services Act. The Police Services Act and its various regulations, including the Equipment and Use of Force Regulation 926, set out the legislative requirements in which force is used, as well as the equipment that officers are able to lawfully carry and deploy. This regulation further provides for lists of approved weapons, training, reporting on using force, and technical specifications for equipment assigned. The Ministry of the Solicitor General further has the police standards manual, which provides the adequacy and standards for training, which police officers, beginning at the basic constable training program, as well as throughout their career, are subject to. This includes content such as training, requalifications, and any certifications associated with this training. Slide 7, please. Municipally, the Police Services Board, use of force governance has been written to provide compliance with the statutes and regulations, including the Criminal Code, the Ontario Provincial Offences Act, as well as the Police Services Act. The board's policy AI-012 from the board policy manual, updated September 2022, provides guidelines for use of force as well as other regulatory requirements for members of OPS, such as annual compliance reporting. This is in line with the Policing Standards Manual and Ontario Regulation 926. Additional board policies that address specialized units will be discussed later in this presentation. Thank you.
All right, I'll continue with the presentation. So what I'm going to do is provide an overview of use of force training that all members receive. And that's not only use of force specific training, but all of the support training that act as building blocks to set up our officers for the most positive outcomes once they become involved in a potential use of force scenario. So use of force training doesn't only consist of static, repetitive exercises. Yes, those types of exercises are necessary in some cases. For example, live fire training for safety purposes, and when new recruits are learning brand new defensive tactics skills. So we do have to have that static training, but the progressive kind of training is dynamic judgment scenario training, where officers operate in a 360-degree environment, and they're able to practice all of their knowledge, skills, and abilities, not only their static skills, but all of those building blocks and the support training that they go through. As Inspector Mbakulo introduced, use of force training in the province of Ontario is heavily regulated by the ministry. All of the equipment, techniques, instructor qualifications are all part of adequacy standards in the province. And we'll start off with training at the recruit level, to start off from the beginning. So last week, the chief and the command team had the opportunity to welcome a brand new recruit class. So this was their first day in the building. It was a good group with diverse backgrounds, work experiences ranging from small business owners to finance, facilities management, paramedic services, social services. So those members sat in a classroom for the first day last week, and in 10 months' time, they're going to be constables on independent patrol, patrolling the streets of Ottawa. So just to run through the training, kind of start to finish, that they receive, it's important that they receive extensive training to properly prepare them for entering the front line of policing. So all recruits go through basically 3 training programs when they're hired. So right now, that group of recruits is at our Professional Development Center. I'll try not to use too many acronyms, but PDC is our training facility, Professional Development Center, and OPC obviously is the Ontario Police College. I'll try to limit the acronyms to those 2 things. But the group of recruits is in their first training period, which we refer to as pre-OPC training, which is a basic orientation. So the week before, those members probably have never held a firearm, have never participated in self-defense training, don't know much about provincial statutes, federal statutes, all of those things. So the pre-OPC training session, which lasts about 6 weeks, is a basic orientation to prepare those recruits for the Ontario Police College. Once they advance the Ontario Police College, that's their basic constable training. So that's the provincially regulated basic constable training program. It lasts for about 14 weeks and encompasses all aspects of training, from academic, statutory training, to use of force training, firearms, driver training, and consists of practical scenarios, academic exams, and all of those things. So once that's completed, and for the class we have at the Ontario Police College, they're actually graduating tomorrow. So once this meeting's over, I believe the Chief and Inspector and McCool are going to be heading towards Elmer, Ontario, to participate in the March Past tomorrow. So once those recruits graduate tomorrow, they're going to come back to the Professional Development Center for what we refer to as their post-OPC training. So their OPC training is quite extensive, and you can see by the graph we have posted there, they receive about 1,700 hours over those 3 training courses. 600 of those are dedicated to use of force and those related building block skills that are used. So there's the use of force specific. There's the communication de-escalation components. There's diversity and bias neutral training, ethics, conducted energy weapons, and I'll go through all of those things more specifically once we move through the presentation. So the post-OPC training program lasts for about, it's usually about 12 to 13 weeks. And once they graduate, again, when they're at the Ontario Police College, they're in a large class of approximately 50 recruit constables from across the province. The attention to detail and the personalized attention and remedial training, it is what it is with a class of 50. Once they come back from the Ontario Police College, we put them through very similar training, but with much smaller groups. So at that point, they're subject to individualized training by our instructors. And then any issues that remain from the Ontario Police College are worked out prior to the recruits moving on to their next stage of training, which is field training. So once they've completed their post-OPC training, they are assigned to their frontline positions. So they report to the front line and begin their field training portion. So they're assigned to a qualified field training officer for a minimum of 50 shifts. So during that time, the Professional Development Center, along with our talent development and performance management sections, keep close watch on the recruits as they advance through their field training. So there are weekly meetings to ensure that the benchmarks are being met by the recruits, and there's regular reports submitted by the coach officers. And once the 50 shifts or thereabouts are completed, the recruit is able to patrol as an independent patrol officer. So start to finish, from the time they first sit in the seat as the group that we welcomed last week to the time they are on independent patrol, that's about a 10-month period. And again, the training chart has a breakdown of all the things. Obviously, we're talking about use of force, but all the academic, legislative, driver training, all of those things are all included in the OPC and post-OPC programs. So all of these things are mandated by the ministry. The ministry regulates all use of force training. So the qualifications that are done at the Ontario Police College, along with the qualifications that we complete in the Professional Development Center, the entire recruit curriculum. So all of the techniques, all of the equipment that recruits are trained on are all outlined in the provincial adequacy standards. So that comes down to what firearm can be used, what ammunition can be used, the type of baton, the type of oleoresin capsicum spray, otherwise known as pepper spray, and all of the specific physical techniques. So it's all broken down in the adequacy standards, and that forms the initial training of all recruits, which comes in the form of those 3 training programs as a recruit. And once they are on independent patrol, they come back for regular requalification training. So we'll go to the next slide. So once they leave the Professional Development Center, go through their field training, and are released to independent patrol, the next time that the member will come for use of force training will be approximately a 12-month period. So, and this continues every 12 months throughout the officer's career. So the contents of the annual requalification training are an exact copy of the basic constable training curriculum. Although the basic constable training, they have about 13 90-minute sessions. All of those things are compressed into one 8-hour requalification day for members. So all of the things that were covered during recruit training are all covered during their 8-hour session. That includes refreshers and requalifications on firearms training. There's classroom sessions on new academic material that may have been released by the ministry. There are defensive tactics, techniques, weapons training, and dynamic training scenarios. And there have been 2 significant and recent ministry updates, both in 2023, the first being the release of the new use of force report, and the second is the new use of force model or training aid, which we'll discuss both of those new releases later on in the presentation. Just to touch on instructors, don't get ahead of me there, Heather. Just one more thing. So there are police, obviously police instructors at the Ontario Police College. At the Professional Development Center, the instructors are Ottawa Police members, sworn members. They are qualified by the Ontario Police College. So all instructors with the Ottawa Police Professional Development Center attend the Ontario Police College for an intensive 3-week instructor trainer program where they have to qualify on teaching defensive tactics, firearms, dynamic scenario evaluations, all of those things to the provincial standard. There's another qualification known as the facilitator. There are facilitator qualifications for all physical skills that are taught to recruits: firearms, defensive tactics, officer safety, which is the dynamic scenario portion, and police vehicle operations. So that's a 3-month training program. It's much more in-depth and intensive. And once completed, the instructor has the same qualification as an Ontario Police College instructor. So at any given time, the Ottawa Police Service have qualified facilitators on staff, and we are able to ensure that all programs are delivered to the Ontario Police College standard. Okay, slide, Heather. All right, moving on to some of the building block training that I mentioned earlier. So recently, a number of human rights and EDI modules have been introduced to OPS members that have become mandatory training throughout the organization. And before, I'll just take a step back. So the Professional Development Center recognized a gap in the ministry curriculum back in 2016. And the members of the Professional Development Center sought out and implemented the Fair and Impartial Policing Program, which addressed a topic that wasn't readily taught in policing at the time, is bias awareness, along with procedural justice and police legitimacy. So the Fair and Impartial Policing Program was released as a standalone course in 2016, which all sworn members took. And since then, it's become included in our annual use of force requalification, and new recruits receive the entire program at the beginning of their career, and then it's reinforced during the requalifications thereafter. So more recently, a number of programs have been released to all members. Those they include, but they're not limited to, the Indigenous Cultural Awareness, Understanding Systemic Racism, which is a Human Rights Commission program, Trauma Informed Training, Anti-Black Racism Learning Section, learning session, an active bystander training for law enforcement, alcohol and drug stigma awareness, among others. So all of those, as we move toward looking at the actual model or training aid itself, it'll become clear once we look at a situation and apply the training aid, how important understanding all of those things are to build up the awareness, whether it's cultural competence, trauma informed, alcohol and the impact of alcohol and drugs, the impact of mental health crisis. All of those things are woven into all the training we do, whether it's our regular use of force program, whether it's our conducted energy weapon program, which also has its own scenario training. And we include all of these things for the officer to be able to recognize and respond to properly under stress in a realistic situation. So, as I mentioned, the principles of fair and impartial policing, especially the procedural justice and police legitimacy, have become significant parts of our training. And fairly recently, we've consulted with our internal subject matter experts, along with those from the community, and co-created a tabletop exercise that has become part of our regular use of force training and part of recruit training. So aside from dealing in dynamic scenarios where time is usually of the essence, we can slow down and have a constructive dialogue while we include the topics that we've studied in these recent courses. So that's become a valuable addition to our recruit training and our regular qualification training, to include all these topics as part of a tabletop discussion where we can work through cooperatively to discuss strategies to for the best possible community outcomes when the police officers attend for a potentially volatile situation. Next slide, please. So we'll talk about de-escalation. De-escalation has been a hot topic for several years now. So in 2014, the PDC team identified another gap in the ministry training, and that was the lack of specific de-escalation related training. So for years back, and once we get into the training aid, we'll talk. The use of force models go back to 1991. Language changes over time. It's always been taught. Principles of de-escalation have been taught under different names, whether it's tactical communication, and whatnot. But the term de-escalation was never formally defined, and it was never specifically included. And it's not a word that was included in previous use of force models or training aids. So the team identified that there was that gap back in 2014. And slide, please. So the team, and just to define it, and this is the current definition, the current ministry definition of de-escalation. So that's the use of verbal and nonverbal strategies intended to prevent conflict or reduce the intensity of a situation without the application of force, and if force is necessary, reducing the amount of force if viable. So what the professional development team did was they researched what was available across the country, and what was found was the Justice Institute of British Columbia had recently released a crisis and de-escalation program that was formed following the Braidwood inquiry, which was as a result of the death of Robert Jacansky at the Vancouver airport. So the GIBC, the Justice Institute of British Columbia program, was seen as the gold standard program available in Canada and in North America at the time. And its concepts, which specifically included a definition of de-escalation, along with a response model. Yes, previous versions of the use of force model gave communication strategies, but not specific to de-escalation. So we again added this as a standalone course in 2014. And ever since, it's been woven into all of our use of force training, including recruit training and requalification training. So the purpose is just to enhance the awareness, specifically of dealing with persons in crisis. And just to walk through the steps, we can go to the next slide. So the steps are, the JIBC program contained its own model with a 4-step approach. So that's basically the first contact, which similar to the Ontario use of force model, you try, if possible, to introduce yourself. Hi, my name is Officer Smith. I'm here to help. What seems to be the problem? And then take it from there. So you do your assessment, build rapport, collaborate to build solutions, and then resolve, and then follow up. It was very basic, but again, a much needed program to fill the gap due to the fact that there was nothing in the current use of force model that specifically addressed de-escalation training. So having said that, the use of force training aid that was just released, it was released a matter of, I believe, 3 weeks ago. This is the first update since 2004. So the ministry update now includes specific strategies on de-escalation, on mental health crisis response. So we're in the process of reviewing our training to see if we will continue with the JIBC de-escalation model, or if the new model is, or the new training aid contains enough specific material for us to build our de-escalation strategy. So that process is happening right now. Next slide, please. So the use of force model. You can go to the next slide. Just before getting into the model itself, so we talked about training, we talked about techniques, we kind of touched on what all frontline officers are issued. So here we kind of have a graphic of everything a recruit would get laid out. So again, everything an officer receives, especially in terms of weapons, body armor, etc., are ministry regulated. So it's not our choice of what we issue. All officers shall carry the equipment listed there. So handcuffs, and again, these are things that they will receive use of force related training on. So the handcuffs, obviously the firearm, which we issue the Glock pistol, the oleoresin capsicum spray, that's the OC spray or pepper spray, and the baton. Also not pictured there is the conducted energy weapon. So the conducted energy weapon is issued to all frontline members right now. And the Ontario Police College also includes basic CEW training as part of the basic constable training program that was recently introduced this year. Again, the common theme is all training and all equipment are ministry approved, and we'll move on to the actual training aid to get an idea of how these techniques and equipment are used. So you can go to the next slide. So this is the newly released 2023 training aid. So this is the Ontario Public Police Interactions Training Aid. It was updated again. The very first use of force model in the province of Ontario was released in 1991. It was very similar to the main model there with the colored rings. It was updated in 2004 with some language changes and just some minor modifications. Since the Ombudsman's report of 2017, part of the recommendations were to update the use of force model in the province of Ontario. So it was 6 years in the making with a lot of consultations, but this model or this training aid was just released. So what I'll do is I'll talk about it a little bit, and I'll go over, if nobody's actually seen a model like this, I'll explain how officers are trained to use it. So just to kind of just talk about what a training aid or a model is and is not. So what the training aid is, the purpose of it is all the things we've discussed up to now, all the items that Inspector Mbakulo talked about, all of the legislation, so the Criminal Code, provincial statutes, the Provincial Offences Act, the Highway Traffic Act, the Liquor License Act, all of those things, the Charter Rights and Freedoms, the Police Services Act, and case law. This model kind of encompasses all of those things and basically it's the governing principles on how they're applied in a use of force situation. The training aid's also obviously mindful of the recommendations that were set out by the Ontario Ombudsman in 2017. Also, recommendations made by various coroners' inquiries following use of force events. And there's been a new focus on academic research and applying that to use of force training. So it's not a replacement for the law. It's not a law itself. It's just an explanation of how force is applied within the guidelines that we are given. It's captured by this training aid with also about a 30-page framework document that explains in depth every single thing that's on there. I'll walk you through about a 5-minute version of it, so you don't have to read the 30-page document. So together, the training aid and the framework are designed to assist police and the public and judges and defense lawyers to understand why and in what manner that an officer responds during an interaction that might involve force. So the ideal goal of any police interaction with the public is that it be cooperative, respectful, peaceful, and that's the way it would end. This training outlines the general principles that govern the interactions with the public, including when force is required. So again, it's important to, as Deputy Bell mentioned, in Ottawa, force is used very seldom. So 99% of police public interactions involve no force whatsoever. So we're talking about a fraction of 1% of police encounters. And usually the large majority of those are initiated by emergency calls from the community. So as we get into this document, remember all of the training that every officer has gone through, they've received prior to entering into a situation where they have to make a decision on how force is used. So all of those things, fair and impartial policing, de-escalation, cultural competence, all of those things are all in the officer's toolkit before they even have the opportunity to approach one of these situations. So we'll talk about we'll do a quick walkthrough of the model, just kind of to make sure everybody knows where to look. So first of all, there's the guiding principles that are listed there in the text box. So preservation and protection of life, public and officer safety, conflict prevention and de-escalation, and the use of the relational approach. And the relational approach is very similar to the model that we implemented it back in 2014 with the GIBC model. So for the first time now in 2023, the ministry has kind of caught up to what we've been doing since 2014, and including this approach, especially to persons in crisis. And when we talk about mental health crisis response or responding to persons in crisis, police officers are not trained as clinicians. They're not meant to make medical diagnosis. They're meant to attend, assess the situation, and determine what barriers there are. So there are in the situation. So if there's communication barriers, if there's potential drug and alcohol, they're not there to make a medical diagnosis and have a complex medical response. They're there to identify what barriers exist and do what they can to remove those barriers if possible, again, to have the situation end with the best result possible. And the line of text at the bottom, the officer continually assesses the interaction and selects the most reasonable option or options relative to the situation and circumstances given the available resources at the time. So that indicates that the situation is always changing, and having a circular model kind of reinforces that. So starting with the Assess, Plan, Act, a circle that's off to the left. So that's meant to be an overlay. So that circle with the Assess, Plan, Act is meant to lay on top of the use of force model and those processes are to run at the same time. So those all those things run concurrently. So obviously the first step is to assess the situation for the officer to make a plan and to act based on what the situation is. The two items in the middle, conflict prevention and de-escalation, are the priorities. So those remain the priorities throughout the interaction. Again, given the opportunity to do so. So conflict prevention obviously is a preemptive effort by using no force. So this is a non-force option. So this is using verbal, non-verbal strategies, coming up with a plan that doesn't involve any force whatsoever and prevents a situation from escalating. De-escalation, we reviewed the definition already. So that's the use of verbal, non-verbal strategies to either prevent or reduce the intensity of the conflict. So moving over to the main portion of the model, and obviously the arrows on the outside reinforce the fact that the SS Plan Act, conflict prevention and de-escalation remain options throughout the situation. So next we'll go to the center of the diagram. So the center consists of the situation and subject considerations. So when the officer responds, as part of the assessment, they'll assess the conditions they're responding to. It could be the weather conditions, responding to a situation on dry pavement versus ankle deep snow or ice will dictate the options that the officer may use. Also, as part of the consideration is the subject. So the subject that they're dealing with, they'll have to make an assessment as to what's happening. Is there a crisis? Is there a crime being committed? Are there multiple subjects? Are there multiple officers? All of those things that'll dictate how to proceed in the interaction. Perceived subject ability, size difference, cognitive ability, all those things are factors. And again, with the new model and the inclusive language that's included in the new training aid and the new use of force report, cultural awareness and gender identity are included in the subject considerations. Now, moving to subject behaviors. So that's the next shaded ring that goes around the center circle. So we start with the identified subject behaviors, starting with cooperative. So that's self-explanatory. Whatever the officer says, the subject complies. There's no necessary use of force or other interventions required until we go to the next phase. So passive resistance is next. So that's basically a subject refuses lawful order, whether it's a trespass situation where the officer asks somebody to leave and they refuse, but they don't do anything about it. So it could be a protest where a subject is lying on the roadway, just dead weight. So they're not physically trying to resist. They're just not complying with the lawful order that the officer is trying to deliver. Going to active resistance, that is the subject is using physical force, but basically defensively. So they'll, if the officer tries to take control of an arm, they'll pull away. They might run away, walk away. All of those things would include active resistance. Assaultive could be a threat to use any force. So punch, kick, spit, headbutt, strikes to the officer. And these are things that do not involve a weapon. Then moving up into the darker shaded area, we have the serious bodily harm or death. So that's likely to have a weapon involved or a technique that is likely to result in serious injury or death. So then we move to the outer rings, which involve the officer. So the blue ring, these are the officer's options on how to respond. So first and foremost, we have the officer presence. Again, just an officer responding in uniform with a marked police car with the lights on potentially changes factors involved. may gain compliance, may have the opposite effect depending on the situation. So these are all, so the officer considerations are items specific to the officer. So that could be the officers. Just as we're assessing the subject, we're also assessing ourselves as we arrive. What's my mindset, my skills, abilities? Is this subject bigger than me? Looks more prepared than me to resist? Do I have what I need here at the time? And then we have the strategic considerations, which become your basic plan. So you're doing your assessment and you're moving into the plan phase. So is this something that can be resolved quickly? Is it something that we have time and distance that we can take our time? Do I wait for backup and whatnot? So moving into the green. So obviously the blue is continuous around the model. So those options are always available, as are the options in the green ring. So these are the verbal and nonverbal communication. So that's your first contact approach, which anytime that it's possible, we like to, the first contact approach has been around for years. That's a friendly approach where you say, hi, my name is Constable so-and-so, and I'm here to help. What can I do for you? And that's how you start building the relational approach. So that's when you're the rapport phase, very similar to the JIBC model, which is now included here, where you could start building your strategy. So you assess your plan, moving into your action phase as to what you can possibly do. Now, the first contact approach and the relational approach are not always possible. If an officer enters a situation that's already escalated beyond the point where it's not appropriate to introduce yourself. You might be a directive approach. The most common directive statement for police, and this is kind of at the top end of the response, is the line, police don't move. So police don't move indicates that somebody is doing something dangerous, approaching the serious bodily harm, death phase. And it's a notice for the subject, for people around, that police are present and there's a potentially dangerous situation that's imminent. However, during those, it's, as the line on the bottom says, there's a continuous assessment of what's happening, because situations change. So subject may have a weapon, and when you say police don't move, the weapon is dropped. So you go from a serious bodily harm or death situation, and it might lower it to a assaultive or actively resistant situation. Then the plan has to constantly change along with those things. The non-force options we spoke about. So that's creating time and distance, creating a situation that the subject will cooperate with, that will end whatever the situation or conflict is. In more dangerous situations, it's the time and distance that that increases the safety component. It's not always possible, but using strategies such as isolate, contain, evacuate, negotiate are things that may create time and distance that will take a situation that seems to be imminent as far as danger or serious bodily harm or death, and kind of lower the temperature to be able to get more resources present, to get more communication, potentially by specialty sections involved. So now to move into the actual use of force options. So we'll start with the yellow portion. So you'll see that the yellow portion begins at the passive resistance phase. So if an officer encounters passive resistance, an appropriate response may be with physical control options. And there's two options in there. There's soft and hard. So soft physical control, kind of the distinction depends on the likelihood of injury. So if a subject is, it's one subject who's just kind of not agreeing to leave a premise, and an officer takes the subject by the arm, walks that person out, that's the end of the conflict. That would be controlling an arm, a wrist lock, a pressure point, that once released, there's no lasting injury. That's considered a soft physical control option. A hard physical control option might include strikes, grounding technique where the officer has to take the subject from a standing position down onto the ground in order to handcuff and better control. So hard techniques obviously are more likely to result in injury, and they are reserved for the more actively resistant and assaultive behaviors by subjects. Moving on to the orange portion. So that's your intermediate weapons. Pepper spray, the OC spray, expandable baton, conducted energy weapon, any less lethal options. And these also include responses by police canine and horses. So for the frontline officer, those are the options. Weapons of opportunity are also included. So anything that might be available at the time that the officer can use to control a situation is considered a weapon of opportunity. So as we progress to serious bodily harm or death, obviously that's the subject behavior where a weapon is likely involved or any technique reasonably considered to result in serious bodily harm or death. And the response option for police is lethal force. That's the red bar. So that's likely to be, it could be firearm. It could be, depending on the situation, it could be physical control techniques that target sensitive areas. But again, this is serious bodily harm or death. If the officer doesn't respond appropriately, they are likely to sustain serious injury or death as a result of this encounter. So that kind of goes through all the components. Again, that's the very short version of the 30-page document, but that's basically how this model is used, where the officer starts in the middle, works their way out, using all of the building block training that we've done to identify any barriers that they may encounter dealing with a subject, whether it be a mental health crisis, drug use, alcohol use, mental illness, and to give them the best opportunity to understand what their options are and to respond appropriately, given that de-escalation is the overarching goal, and to bring the situation to a peaceful ending is the main goal of all police interactions. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So conducted energy weapons, kind of left this as the last use of force option to discuss. We can go to the next slide. So the conducted energy weapon, or the CEW, dates back to the original testing and evaluation goes back to the year about 2000. So our tactical unit was one of the first in Canada to begin testing and evaluating, which was a new product at the time, the conducted energy weapon. So it finally achieved ministry approval in the early 2000s, and the approval was for tactical and hostage rescue units only. So that was a limitation of the use of the conducted energy weapon. So throughout the years, and as a result of other incidents that happened across the country and other reviews and coroner's inquest results, the recommendation, or the CEW was recognized as potentially a life-saving weapon, where under certain circumstances, officers might have a window of opportunity in a serious bodily harm or death situation to deploy a CEW to get the situation under control, where if that wasn't there and available, the only other option would have been to use lethal force and use a firearm. So that came as a result of several coroners' inquests across Canada, and therefore the expansion of the use of CEWs was beginning to be examined. So they were first introduced in the early 2000s. By the late 2000s, the first expansion was being considered. So that was due to the delay in time to get a tactical officer to a situation. The use would be expanded to frontline supervisors. So frontline sergeants would be available to be trained and issued a CEW. So again, those things come first with ministry approval. And then second, whenever we expand programs like this, the second step is always going to the Police Services Board for approval. So the ministry and the board approvals happened for that expansion in the late 2000s, which soon expanded to frontline constables as well. So select frontline constables were authorized to use CEWs, again, ministry approval followed by board approval in about 2012. And then the last large expansion of the CEW program was in 2018. So that's when the ministry finally approved that CEWs can be issued to all members of an organization, regardless of their position. So it became part of the issued equipment that all police officers may have. It's not a must-have, but it's a may-have. Therefore, after the ministry approval in 2018, we prepared a board report which highlighted, including community consultation, the recommendations to expand to issue CEW to all members of the police service from the chief of police all the way down to recruit constables. So that was in place in 2018. In 2022, the program was clawed back somewhat, mostly due to budget constraints. So here we adjusted our deployment model to only include frontline officers. The CEW is an expensive device. It is a sensitive electronic device as opposed to a firearm. A firearm is a very robust mechanical device that we can fix ourselves with qualified armorers that meet ministry approval. The CEW is a sensitive electronic device that we cannot fix ourselves. It's a sealed device that has a 5-year operational lifespan. And once 5 years are up, that device has to be taken out of service. So again, that's the rationale for the slight clawback in 2022. So you can go to the next slide. So like any other Ottawa Police program, this is a ministry approved program. The instructors are also ministry approved. The Ontario Police College has taken ownership of the Ontario CEW program. All of our instructors receive their OPC instructor credentials, which is ministry approved, and the ability to come back here through the Professional Development Center and train our own. So we have a 2-day new user course on the CEW. Our current issue is pictured. It's the Taser 7. That's manufactured by Axon. Again, useful lifespan of 5 years. And then after that, each officer returns to PDC for it's a 5-hour refresher every year. Again, ministry approved. Next slide. So now we'll move into the reporting requirements. So again, anytime force is used, the ministry requires the officer and the police service to submit a use of force report. So the situations that require a use of force report are listed. Basically, anytime an officer draws, points, or discharges a firearm, anytime an officer draws or deploys a CEW, anytime an intermediate option or intermediate weapon is applied to a person, or anytime any force whatsoever is used that results in an injury. And an injury is when a person requires any medical attention, whether it be from a medical doctor, nurse, or paramedic. So that's the conditions where a use of force report has to be submitted. So the officer is responsible for submitting the report. It's reviewed by that officer's chain of command and then submitted to the Professional Development Center, where a use of force analyst reviews the document to ensure that the force used was reasonable and appropriate given the situation and in keeping with provincial training requirements. If so, the report is submitted to the ministry. So the ministry now collects all use of force reports and basically submits a provincial report at the end of the year. The Ottawa Police Service are responsible to submit a report to the board, which I believe has recently been done. And the main change, again, this document, which I believe is included in your package, was originally issued in 1991. There were very few updates up until 2020. So in 2020, the race data was added to the use of force report. So it was a bit of an afterthought. It was just kind of a box in an old and dated PDF form. So starting in 2020, we have reported our race data to the board and to the ministry. And at the beginning of this year, the ministry finally released a modernized, a much better document that includes race data, gender, age data, all the data points that were kind of missing in the past that we'd like to report on have now finally been introduced with the 2023 report. So those results with the new and more interactive report that includes inclusive language, includes many more details, will kind of inform this year. So this is our first year using them. So we won't be reporting the results using the new report until early 2024. So the 2023 calendar year will be the first time we're going to be implementing the new modernized reports that have been, from what I understand, have been much better and much more user-friendly. And from our perspective as responsible to analyze what force is being used and where, it'll allow us to produce better end-of-year results and better end-of-year reports. So again, all these reports at the end of the year are submitted to the ministry. They're monitored by the Ontario Anti-Racism Data Standards to ensure that we're conducting ourselves and we have all the training in place for our officers to respond properly. Slide, please. Sorry, I already covered that. So we'll go to the next one. So we'll transition here. So the one frontline weapon that we didn't discuss, just because it's not issued to all members, is the patrol carbine, which is seen on the picture on the left of that graphic. So that's the long gun issued to some selected frontline officers for use in very specific situations. The training, again, the weapon itself and the training program are ministry training programs. Our instructors attend the Ontario Police College for their carbine instructor credentials and are able to develop and implement that training here at the Professional Development Center. So again, the theme has been whatever we use, whatever is issued, whatever is new that's coming out has to be approved by the ministry prior to it being issued to police officers. And just in the transition from frontline policing into specialized policing, which I'll hand over to Superintendent Dow very soon, that all of the training, once we move into specialized units, that's usually the emergency services unit and the tactical unit. They do have some use of force options that are not issued to the front line. Those specialized weapons and the training and the instructor training that go along are all also standardized and mandated by the ministry. So with that, I will pass it over to Superintendent Dow.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you all. So I'll be talking about the tactical deployment strategies, specifically the dynamic entry. First, I want to clarify that the topic of dynamic entry in this deck pertains to the use in circumstances of high risk, judicially authorized search warrants to ensure the preservation of evidence and safety of officers and the public. It doesn't refer to the use during exigent circumstances, for example, during hostage takings or active shooter, violent domestic assaults, or barricaded persons. Let me start by defining the dynamic entry. As you see by the slide, here, the dynamic entry is a systemic and methodical approach of moving a structure whereby tactical members can physically clear each room and occupants found inside. This initiated by forced entry, announcement of a search warrant, and police don't move. Police don't move will be repeated through a while engaging and changing levels and while someone is located. During the search warrant, all members of the police services are identified as police officers and maintain, and the main objective is to secure the residence or building in a timely manner. Excuse me. This is used to limit the movement of occupants and reduce the ability to formulate a plan of defense or to limit the ability to destroy evidence. The dynamic entry is a low frequency but high risk technique used by Canadian police services that has evoked a great deal of scrutiny and criticism in the past from various audiences, including the media, the public, the courts, and advocates for police reform. We're aware of this criticism and have continuously monitored the use of this tactic, and we've ensured that the least amount of force is necessary to use during the high-risk warrants. Next slide, please. The tactical section is mandated by the Ontario Ministry of Solicitor General to have the capabilities to perform specific operations, which include the dynamic entry, a strategy only exercised in our service by the tactical section. Tactical team members undergo an extensive training regimen outlined by the Police Services Manual, which includes a minimum of 576 hours of training annually to review and maintain the skills which include use of force, sharpshooter qualifications, rappel master, and general tactical training, including methods of entry, joint training with other police services, crisis negotiators, training with incident commanders, public order units, hostage rescue. And having participated in the review of the tactical unit, I can attest that the OPS exceeds all training requirements by the ministry. It's important to acknowledge that when officers execute a search warrant, a judicial officer has reviewed the grounds and authorized the entry and search of the premise. The method the police use to make the entry while executing a search warrant rests with the officers executing the search warrant, though the court has provided considerable guidance regarding acceptable practices. The general rule that the court set out is for officers to knock and announce prior to entry, which helps protect the privacy and safety of citizens enjoy in their residences. Where officers depart from the knock and announce rule, they must explain why they thought it was necessary to do so. The greater the departure the police use from the knock and announce rule, the heavier the onus is on them to justify what they did. With regards to the review of policies, procedures, and training, in early 2021, the OPS conducted an extensive review of its use of tactical operations, including dynamic entries, part of which included the review of practices in other police services in Ontario and Canada, and how they compare to the Ottawa Police Service. And this review in 2021 led to improvements in training across several sections and to the reevaluation of the methods of entry, and has greatly reduced the instances where dynamic entries have been used during search warrants. For instance, in 2020, out of 88 high-risk search warrants involving the tactical team, 59 were dynamic entries, and the other methods were breach and call out and knock and announce. The following year, in 2021, dynamic entries were down to 2. In 2022, of 56 high-risk search warrants, there were 3 dynamic entries. And in 2023, year to date to this day, there have been 3. The decisions to determine the optimal approach to executing a judicially authorized search warrant entry are made by highly trained critical incident commanders on a case-by-case basis, and they balance a variety of factors and risks. As part of the Ottawa Police Service's duty of care, we have to balance the responsibility to enhance community safety and well-being by performing the essential role of enforcement, which includes the execution of search warrants in order to obtain necessary evidence for successful prosecution of criminal offenders. We also have to balance and ensure that we perform a role in the matter that helps the victims ensures the safety and well-being of members of the community and our members, while using the minimal amount of force required to achieve these positive outcomes. It's important to highlight that in all dynamic entry cases, highly trained police officers will consider how best to enter the location by using the most appropriate means, taking all the appropriate precautions to mitigate risk to all person and to preservations of the evidence that we're seeking. The safety of all community members and members of our service is paramount, and that's what guides every aspect of our threat assessments, decision-making, operations, and post-incident actions. We recognize that the execution of search warrants can be traumatizing to those found in a residence where the warrant is being executed, regardless of method of entry. And at times, persons who aren't suspects or accomplices are located inside the premises being searched. Other times, neighbors may be concerned about why the police are in the area. In these situations and others, investigators offer assistance from our victim assistance unit to occupants and neighbors and provide necessary information on how to recover property damage or make a complaint. In all cases, we ensure that consistent with OPS's duty of care, the safety and well-being of all occupants is prioritized. Slide, please.
Thanks, Frank. So we've given you a pretty detailed base on training, equipment, regulations, and laws surrounding use of force. I want to spend a few minutes discussing important oversight and reporting mechanisms that are in place that ensure transparency and accountability, as well as some of the activities that we're currently engaged in to further progress and advance on this transparency and accountability. In addition, next slide, please. Thank you. In addition to reporting on use of force yearly through the annual report process, we have multiple mechanisms of oversight, including the SIU, OIPRD, Professional Standards Unit, internal operational reviews, and court cases that are reviewed through the charter. So the Special Investigations Unit is a provincial civilian law enforcement agency that has jurisdiction over municipal, regional, and provincial police officers, as well as special constables employed by the Niagara Parks Commission and peace officers with the Legislative Protective Services in Toronto. The SIU will conduct a criminal investigation following police involvement in any incident where one or more of the following occurs. There's death of a person, serious injury of a person who we're engaged with, discharge of a firearm towards any person, or the sexual assault of a person as reported by that person. It is important to note that the Special Investigations Unit is independent of any police service and operates at arm's length from the Ministry of the Attorney General. The Office of the Independent Review Director is responsible for receiving, managing, and overseeing all public complaints about municipal, regional, and provincial police officers in Ontario. The Independent Civilian Oversight Agency makes sure the public complaints about police members are dealt with in a manner that is transparent, effective, and fair to both the public and the police. Beyond this, we have our Professional Standards Unit, who will on occasion process and review or investigate use of force incidents. We also are regularly reviewed by courts in use of force as it relates to any of the use of force and its application to people's charter rights. The OPS also conducts a variety of internal operational reviews and debriefs, both formal and informal, and in some circumstances where force is used. In 2020, we not only began collecting and reporting race data in use of force reports, but we took the additional step of engaging an external organization to review historical use of force data and to review use of force practices. The work was undertaken by subject matter experts from York University. Through their work, the subject matter experts from York determined that historically, use of force was used disproportionately by OPS members against members of particular communities, specifically those in the Black, Middle Eastern, and Indigenous communities. At the same time, use of force against white subjects was less than would be expected based on percentages of population. The findings from the review were shared with the Community Equity Council, who worked with the OPS and York University to develop a series of recommendations. As a result of this review and with the input of the CEC, there were 4 recommendations, as you can see on the screen, that were created and outputs of that body of work. You can go on to the next slide, please. So to address the 4 recommendations, all that suggested the OPS increase its collection, use, and reporting of race data and increased accountability. The OPS with the CEC is engaged in 2 streams of work: developing a race and identity based data strategy and creating a use of force community review panel. In terms of the race and identity-based data strategy, the OPS is in the midst of creating a multi-year social identity data strategy. The strategy is being built in consideration of findings of the use of force external review recommendations, as well as based on findings from reviews done in the past. The strategy not only is being built based on feedback from CEC, but will be presented to the CEC at various stages for consultative purposes. It's our goal and is anticipated that implementation of a strategy will result in better identification of drivers of disparity, will improve community safety, and will improve accountability and transparency, as well as public trust. The OPS is also working with the Community Equity Council in the coming months to develop a subcommittee of the CEC. The panel will be tasked with reviewing OPS use of force and de-escalation scenarios. Creating this panel not only addresses a recommendation that was made in the 2020 use of force race-based data report, but creates additional governance and oversight of use of force incidents. The panel will review OPS use of force and will review the circumstances that led to the encounters, the force used, and possible alternatives or training to be developed and employed in the future. Outcomes of panel work will not focus on OPS member discipline, but will be an additional control measure and opportunity to ensure that we are, as a service, employing de-escalation and use of force techniques as efficiently, effectively, and appropriately as possible. Work is underway to determine the composition of the panel and to establish good governance. The panel will be structured and will operate in a similar way to the community-led committees that have successfully and beneficially been reviewing sexual assault files in the past number of years. So we covered a lot of information there, I know that, and I'm hoping we have opportunity to have some questions and dialogue around that. So with that, thank you to the team for all the work they did, and over to you, Chair Dussault.
Thank you, Deputy Bell. Thank you, Chief Subs, Deputy Bell, and team for your very comprehensive presentation and explanations. At this point, I will begin by opening it up to the P&G Policy and Governance Committee members for any questions. And following that, I will go to other board members for questions. So, committee members, any questions for our presenters? Member Fakurani, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank the service for the excellent presentation and the details that were in the presentation. Very much appreciate all the training, etc., and the review that's gone on. So thank you for that. I've got basically, from my perspective, I've got 2 concerns on sort of the use of force, and by and large, they've been addressed, but one is of course the race data that we were presented with earlier this year, and understanding the work that's being done, I think is really important. It's really significant to build trust within these communities. That's the ultimate goal, and to reduce the discrimination that's at play. Is there something further you could speak to? And I think I'm looking at Deputy Chief Bell on this probably, in terms of sort of performance targets. I know it's mentioned on one of the slides, and maybe too early. I mean, the ultimate goal is, of course, to have no disparity at all. But how are we going to get there? And it's a long-standing issue for racialized communities. So that's one of the, and I know there's a race data strategy, etc. There'll be more training, but but how do we get there so the biases, etc., that are present are not acted upon in providing services to these communities? The other issue that's sort of on my mind is with respect to the dynamic entries. And I'm pleased to see the reduction in dynamic entries. I know the reason for the 2021 review. What I wanted to know is in terms of the approvals for a search warrant, does that go through the command structure, or is it left at the operational level? And then what if any, is there the role for the board to be informed of after the fact? So we're not talking about before or anything, but after the fact that this occurred, is there some type of reporting that a dynamic entry warrant was executed? And we're seeing like 2 to 3, so I'm not thinking that it's substantial, not to the 59 that were in previous year, to 2020, I believe. So that's the other thought process that's going through my mind. And then the other question I have is with respect to the criminal code that was mentioned at the beginning, sort of the macro level. In the last 3 to 5 years, what are the number of, if any, I believe there has been, criminal code charges on the use of force pertaining to an officer? And I don't want to know the results of those charges, but I want to know what lessons learned or what has the service done to sort of learn from those incidents, whether the charges were in fact withdrawn or proved or not guilty. That's not really the concern to me. The concern is what lessons were learned from those incidents, because something had to have happened to actually have the criminal charges laid to begin with. So, that's those are my questions for now, Chair. Thanks.
So thank you, Member Fraccarani. So I'll start with the first question, and then I'll look to the chief whether he wants me to continue with the dynamic entries or not. So great question around, so we've got the data, we've got the start, what's next, and how do we actually manage to improve our outcomes and have less disparity? Am I capturing the question? Okay, perfect, thank you. So I think we've, as a police service, taken one of the most unique approaches to the race-based use of force data in the country, definitely in the province, likely in the country. And that is, we've brought in external race-based data experts to review it and give the result as opposed to doing it ourselves. And we've engaged our community partners through the CEC to actually take that analyzed data and look at it as a whole to try and help us figure out what are some things we can do in those areas to improve. So based on the social identity and race-based data strategy that we're developing, and the CEC committee to review all use of force encounters, I think it's too early to answer your question. I think we've put those pieces in place. We have to move them ahead. We have to continue to work with our academic partners and our community partners to come up with the answers that you're seeking, because I think that's where we'll get the best buy-in from our community. We'll get the best results for our organization and be able to deliver the best service. So I can't give you a target now. Ultimately, my target would be zero disparity. That's what we're always shooting for. But I think we actually have to work with our community partners and our academic partners to actually plot out tangible, achievable, realistic targets and start to move towards those. So I would never be as presumptive enough to set those on our own. I think we have to do it with the people we've brought in to help us manage that. So I hope that answers your question.
That's a fair comment. Yeah, that's a fair response. Thank you.
Chief, over to you for the dynamic entries.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the dynamic entries, and I want to be sure, and I know, being a lawyer, member Fakirani, of course, the search warrants that we do obtain are issued by a justice of the peace or a judge, depending on the type of warrant that it is. So we have that oversight in terms of that approval. the ultimate oversight of that operation goes to the critical incident commander of the event, who controls the operational and tactics for our tactical team. Is there, some of the common options are, okay, a dynamic entry, or we contact the person inside, have them walk out, or we do what's called a breach and hold, where we break the door down but don't enter and just hold the door and try to get them come. There's various different types. We can send a robot in through a window, we can or through a door. There's a whole bunch of different options that they have, and that CIC has to examine the risk that's involved, the totality of the circumstances, and be that approving body, yay or nay. And the way the program works with the CIC is they are in charge, and they don't have, like, for example, me as the chief, I won't direct a CIC in terms of what they're doing or not doing. They have the qualifications, and they have the right to run that. Now, I mean, I could ultimately do that, but it is their operation. So I just wanted to be sort of clear on that, and maybe I'll move on to the other one on dynamic entries in regards to reporting to the board. As you mentioned, with the frequency that we have now, it's not a ridiculous amount of reporting if we had to report on every instance. Certainly, if that is something that is manageable, because it is so few, and the manner of how we report and the details, certainly we can work out, with the board as well too. Or it can be a quarterly. Of course, we will report it annually, so that frequency of the reporting, for example, it happens on Friday night and the board would like to know Monday morning, or within that quarter, we would have to discuss.
Yeah, I think that's fair too, Chief. And for me, I'm more concerned about any trend lines. So it doesn't have to be the next day. Like, that's not my concern. That we leave to you and your team. But I'm more concerned to see some trend lines. That's my concern.
Great, thank you. I will open up the floor to questions from any board members at this point in time. Are there any other questions for the service at this point? Yes, Chief. You have a question for the service.
Yeah, I do. Member Pakarani's third question there in regards to the criminal code charges against the members and the lessons learned and whatnot. I just wanted to address that. I don't know that that number off the top of my head, but however, that is something that we can easily get. And I think whenever we do have somebody that is charged, and this is more my experience in my career versus specifically here, but we. Often when there is a charge, there is some obvious indicators on what occurred, and they are reviewed in its entirety in terms of what we did or didn't do. And that member specifically who's being charged, once they go through that process, whether it's a conviction or an acquittal, and then they go through the PSA process, again, substantiated or not, will dictate sort of our path on that. But every time that we see that, in the past that I've seen a criminal code charge, we do a file review to understand what we did or didn't do. And was it an individual decision by a particular member, a mistake? Was it emotionally based, or was it a very complex situation that a decision had to be made very quickly, and perhaps it was the wrong one, but it was a decision that had to be made under duress? So there's a whole bunch of factors that come into a criminal charge, and they do have to get reviewed individually.
Great, thank you. Deputy Chief Bell.
Thank you, Chair Doucette. So as we wrap up, what I'd like to let you know is we also have a board report prepared that we can provide to the committee if they want, or we can table at the next board meeting. So just kind of looking for next steps in relation to this motion, but also to let you know that we do have a board report ready and prepared to be submitted at whichever point you see fit.
Oh, great, thank you. We'll get back to you on further direction on that in due time. Chief Stubbs, did you have another?
Yes, it's just more not a question, a comment. I just wanted to say, as there's not a lineup of questions there from the board, I do want to say this. Coming on board with the service, I of course was part of a day-long use of force day to get my firearm and get qualified in Ontario on the different weapons and whatnot. I've had exposure to the PDC in a number of different sort of venues and whatnot. I am very comfortable with our team at PDC. At the time, acting Inspector LeBlanc was running that operation. Very good instructors, very professional. And it's interesting, I hear different things from other services, from the RCMP, that we have a good program, highly respected. And I have a lot of confidence in those folks and what they're transferring to the membership across the service. So that I just wanted to give the board that confidence that we do have a very good program here in Ottawa. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for adding that as well. Okay, if there are no further questions, I will that the Ottawa Police Services Board's Policy and Government Committee receive this item for information. Is this item received?
Received.
Great, thank you. Okay, on to the next item, 4.2, review of board policy GA1 board member job description. The executive director prepared a report on this item. The main precursor for the review of this policy is the Auditor General's recommendations related to the convoy response, and specifically a recommendation around ensuring the job descriptions for board members accurately reflect the time and commitment required for the role. Does anybody have any comments on the proposed policy changes? Okay, thank you. Now moving on, that the Ottawa.
Sorry, Chair. I was just going through my notes. The only comment I have is with respect to page 19 of the report, and it says additional remuneration is provided. It's sort of the last box on their annual remuneration, and it says additional remuneration is provided for non-council board members elected to the role of chair and vice chair. I think it's only to the role of the chair. I don't think it extends to the vice chair, so maybe the executive director can just confirm.
Hi there. I can confirm that there is additional compensation for the vice chair's role.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions on the policy? Okay, now that the Ottawa Police Services Board's Policy and Governance Committee review the board policy GA1 board member job description and endorse recommended changes for board approval. Is this recommendation carried?
Carried.
Great, thank you. Item 4.3, review of board policy CR17 major events. This item also relates to a recommendation from the Auditor General's review of the convoy response. I understand the executive director made some initial changes to the board policy for consideration, which relate to the specific feedback provided by the EG in her report. Given what occurred in the past, the committee is in consultation with the chief, and his staff may have other amendments to suggest. I want to note that while the recommendation for this item suggests we endorse the proposed changes and recommend them to the board for approval, there's still an opportunity for further discussion and changes before it goes to the board. With that, I will open the floor for comments. Okay, and I'll begin with Chief Stubbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In regards to the consultation, again, we at the OPS were very supportive of the policy that was drafted and the idea of this. It's important that we put on paper the practice of providing relevant and timely information, to the board as it relates to a major event, and really reflects the practice that we've, been committed to and following, I think, in events post convoy. In our legal reviews, we've just noticed some language that we feel might need just some tweaking. So we were, and just to make sure it aligns with the PSA. So we were just requesting that our staff have an opportunity to sit down with the executive director and just review some of the wording. Really not anything that is substantially different, just some tweaking. So we appreciate that opportunity.
Great, thank you. Absolutely. Any other comments or questions on the policy? Member Fakarani.
Thank you, Chair. The only other comments I would make with respect to this policy is I reviewed I believe it's the Halton police policy, and there are a couple of principles there that are important. I think that we may want to just cross-reference to ensure we capture it in our policy. One is related to sort of the intelligence-led, rights-aware, and proportionate. And that's 2.3 of that policy. And also 2.2, it's the mitigation plans, to make sure that we capture the fact that our policy should ensure that there's mitigation plans identified as well. And then I will I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Member Fakarani. And over to you again, Chief Stubbs.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. To Member Fakarani, as a matter of fact, the Halton policy is something that we have looked at and quite like, and that's part of what we would like to discuss going forward. So you sort of nailed that comment in regards to some of our thoughts as well too. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Chief. Okay, moving on now, that the Ottawa Police Services Board Policy and Governance Committee review Board Policy CR17 major events and endorse a recommended approach, recommended changes for board approval. Is the recommendation carried? Oh, I'm sorry, Member Henschel.
Yeah, sorry. I hope it's okay if I just provide just a quick question or comment. On section 1.4, the last paragraph talks about through the review process, the board may provide recommendations to the chief where it believes the mission, objectives, and priorities are not being achieved. However, the chief remains free to accept or reject the board's recommendations. So I agree with that, but I'm wondering if it wouldn't be helpful just to have a comment in there that if the chief disagrees or rejects any of the board's recommendations, that there's some conversation or he at least advises the board. Because I think it would be helpful to just to have an understanding of what's happening. I don't think it's going to be a problem with this particular board and this particular chief, but I think in the broader context of policy, it would be helpful to say that where the chief doesn't accept the board's recommendations and the chief advises and maybe, and provides a, rationale why or whatever. Just, I think it's really good to ensure that the relationship stays healthy, but also that the board is aware of if the chief isn't doing something that he or she isn't and the reasons thereof.
Great, thank you. Sounds entirely reasonable for sure. Any comments on that, Chief? Are you okay with that?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that's very reasonable.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, if there are no further questions, is the recommendation carried with the caveats and dialogue we've had?
Carried.
Carried. Thank you. Moving on to 4.4, review of board resourcing requirements. The committee was provided a copy of a report prepared by the executive director, which mirrors a report that was previously provided to the Human Resources Committee for consideration. When the HR committee last met, it suggested this report come to P&G for further discussion, given this committee's mandate for governance and the fact that resourcing is fundamental to our governance. At this time, I'd like to ask the HR Committee Chair, to provide some comments on this item before we go to questions and comments from the committee. Member Henschel, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. I think this was raised also. The item was also presented at the board meeting last week. So I'm not going to repeat too much of what was said there, but I think one of the key things from this is that we looked at this and had some really good insight from the current head of or the executive director of the acting executive director of the board in Toronto, of what they've done there. And I think that what the Toronto Police Services Board has done is sort of leading the way that things should be done to support a board properly in fulfilling its mandate under the Act. And certainly with the new Act, when that comes into force, there will be additional requirements for the board and additional expectations of the board. And so for the board office to be able to support the board properly and in an independent manner, it is really important that we look at this particular issue and increasing the resources. I think from that conversation that we had with the Toronto Police Services Board and sort of the key functions, and they've moved beyond what they currently have, and they're adding actually some more bodies. But I think as the one thing I wanted to sort of bring to the board's or to the committee's attention was that, and it's sort of taken from what the acting executive director from the Toronto Police Service Board suggested. But as a minimum starting point, he had sort of suggested to make sure that beyond the executive director, there was also a board management or manager, which I would sort of say are equal to maybe a executive assistant to the executive director, and also to have an administrative assistant. And then at the minimum, he said one, policy analyst, and potentially also somebody an analyst dealing with communications and outreach. He had suggested that if you could maybe combine those, but that would be very challenging, very difficult. And I agree with that. I think that we should be looking or my recommendation would be to consider as a next step of sort of what we should do as a next level of enhancing the board office is to look at that of having an executive, beyond the executive director, having an executive assistant, an administrative assistant, a policy analyst position, and then a outreach communications analyst position. I think that to me would be a minimum to actually get some of the work done that is not currently getting done and that we need to do. And then as we evolve and see how that works, then I think we would be in a better position to say, okay, is that sufficient, or are there other areas that we need to look at, or are there additional resources we need? And one of the reasons we wanted to, as a committee, wanted to bring it to this committee was because although these are HR issues, but everything the board does is really around the governance of the police service board, of the police service. And so I think from a policy and governance perspective, it was really important to bring it to this committee just to see, have we missed anything, or are there any additional thoughts that might come to this before we continue working on sort of the next, or the immediate pressures that we have, and looking at that short-term staffing plan. So I'll leave it at that. Happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Thank you, Member Chair, Member Henschel. Sounds like a very practical and pragmatic way forward. With that, I'll open it up to the P&G committee members for comments or questions, and then to any other members with us today. Member Fakrani.
I would support Member Henschel's views, and particularly some policy support would be helpful for the board. So if we're prioritizing, I think that's a higher priority for support.
Thank you, Member Fakrani. Any other comments? Are we all in agreement on the way forward? I'm seeing. Great. Thank you very much. With that, that the Ottawa Police Services Board's Policy and Governance Committee received this item for information and discussion as referred by the Human Resources Committee. Is this item received?
Received.
Fantastic. Thank you. Is there any other business for the P&G Committee today? Our next meeting date is still to be determined. Can I please have a motion for adjournment?
Motion for adjournment.
Thank you, Member Fakhrini. Thank you to everybody who participated. Good meeting. Lots of very, very useful information. Thank you to the service for that. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.